Dark days in Venezuela, literally, today on The World. I'm Marco Werman. Venezuela is broke, power outages are common, consumer goods are scarce, and the government is in complete chaos.
This makes the U.S. Congress look like a cocktail party.
Okay, that is bad. Plus, a Kurdish representative in the U.S. says she's been preparing for the job since childhood.
I was 11 years old, but I think politically I was probably 28. And I used to talk about world affairs. I used to talk about Kissinger. And my 11-year-old friends didn't know who Kissinger was.
And an Australian singer finds inspiration in a Chinese science fiction story.
It's a metaphor. I guess it's sort of disguised in the ramblings of a madman who thinks that everyone around him is eating people.
That's all today on The World. Glad you could be with us on this Friday. It almost seemed like old times in Baghdad today. A U.S. Secretary of State flew into the Iraqi capital for meetings with local leaders. John Kerry's message, though, today, the U.S. will be bringing even more pressure to bear on the so-called Islamic State, or Daesh, as Kerry calls it.
We will continue targeting and taking out Daesh's leaders, and we will train local forces to take and hold more ground.
Iraqi Kurds are watching this closely. They're on the front lines of the fight against ISIS, specifically their Peshmerga forces. Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman is the Kurdish representative here in the U.S. She came to our studios today and told me that there is progress in the fight against ISIS, but big problems remain, like the hundreds of thousands of refugees now living in Kurdish-controlled northern Iraq.
Our population is about 5.5 million. This is a huge influx of people. It means that our services are all stretched. Electricity, which used to be 24 hours a day, now is maybe half that. Healthcare, our hospitals are bursting with people who need attention. Everybody is struggling. We are struggling, and the refugees and the displaced.
Well, I was going to ask you, Bayan, how do you lobby for these causes in Washington, a city that's already deeply distracted by what's going on with the refugee crisis in Europe?
You know, the refugee crisis in Europe is obviously linked to what's happening in Iraq and Syria. And unless you give the refugees and the displaced something where they're already based in the Middle East, of course they will give up and go to Europe. If I may give you some examples, because the UN has been struggling to raise money, enough money, to really deal with the humanitarian crisis in Kurdistan and Iraq, the financial vouchers for the people in the camps have diminished. The food basket has shrunk. 55% of the children, the displaced children in Kurdistan, are not in school. Now, if you're a parent, you see there's not enough food on the table. Your children have been out of school for 1 or 2 years. Of course, you'll give up everything and try to put everyone on a boat, risk their lives to go to Europe.
People are fleeing because of violence and extremism, and I know the impact of terrorism is something that's personal for you. You lost both your father and your brother in an attack some years ago. Tell us about that and how it affected your life. In fact, I would guess changed your life.
My father and my brother were killed by Islamist terrorists. It was a suicide bombing, and in fact almost 100 people died. It did change my life. We sort of sometimes thought that our father might be killed because he was in the forefront of the Kurdish movement.
Right.
He and my mother were sentenced to death by Saddam Hussein. He was a Peshmerga in his early days. So I think the possibility of my father being killed was always in the back of our minds. But I didn't expect my elder brother, who was only 3 years older than me, to be killed in that way. In the way it changed my life is that it galvanized me to be more proactive, to serve the people of Kurdistan. You know, I want to say this, if I may. People always ask me about their death, but I remember their lives. You know, my father struggled almost his entire life for the freedom movement, to liberate the people of Kurdistan from genocide, from oppression, from Saddam Hussein. My brother did the same in his own way. It's their lives that inspire me, not so much their deaths.
Well, I was going to ask you, I mean, you're technically a representative, but you're kind of this ambassador, almost activist. That's kind of the role you serve. Do you do that because you had family members who died as a result of extremism?
I was born into a family that was very active in the Kurdish liberation movement.